So we start asking why even write a book on this, on Darwin and intelligent design. And well, the reason is actually it's an extremely important topic because we are touching on life itself and ultimately what value we put in life and existence and so on. And whatever thoughts or conclusions we reach within that field have ramifications for practically anything we do. This was hinted to in 1999 by one of the 20th century's most well-known evolutionary biologist, Ernst Mayr, who stated, no biologist has been responsible for more and for more drastic modifications of the average person's worldview than Charles Darwin. Mayr pointed out that whereas other scientists, such as, for example, Albert Einstein, definitely had a marked influence within his own field, in this case physics, but the ramifications for mankind as such, for how his ideas affected the general public, the layman, probably not much. Didn't make much difference if Einstein had been there or not. But Darwin turned everything upside down. There was a time before Darwin, there was a time after Darwin. Darwin touched the core of our understanding of the value of life and the value of existence. And that's actually why this is such a crucial discussion. And this is also why probably whenever one brings up topics and even like critique of Darwin, there's actually a lot of emotion involved. Many people, this is something exciting and something. So you can ask, what was it that Darwin did that was so radical? This was explained by Francisco Ayala, an American contemporary biologist, who stated Darwin's greatest accomplishment was to show that the complex order and function in living creatures can be explained as a result of a natural process, natural selection, without having to refer to a creator or some other external factor. This is what Darwin actually did. He broke a tradition because before Darwin, practically all scientists were of the opinion that life is too complex of a nature to be explained by purely natural or physical processes. And scientists, the majority of all the prominent scientists for centuries were actually theists. Not necessarily that they were strong adherent in one particular religion, although some were, but they were, but practically 100% they were theists, seeing that nature cannot be explained without a kind of intelligence behind that is involved in creation and the unfolding of nature. And Darwin, he changed that. Now, of course, one thing is interesting here. We have often the idea that you cannot mix science and ideas of some kind of transcendent divine intelligence or something like that. This is not scientific. However, if that's the case, then Darwin cannot be included in the scientific discussion because Darwin introduces that idea that there is a transcendent intelligence behind nature, and then he argues against it, which is fine, but he does introduce the idea. And if Darwin can introduce the idea and argue against it, also it should be okay to argue for it. So that's one point. So, but scientists, for the most part, they were actually of the opinion before Darwin that there must be some kind of intelligence behind nature. For example, Newton stated in his Principia, probably the most important book on science ever written, in the middle of a book packed with mathematical formulas and calculations of planetary orbits and gravitation and Newton's mechanics. In the middle of all sun, planets, and comets could only proceed from the counsel and dominion of an intelligent and powerful being. And that was not controversial. Newton was as mainstream as you get. Newton's argument was that, whereas it's possible to explain the behavior of sun and planets with his laws of motion and so on, but how that order came to be in the first place, that could only be explained by an intelligent being behind. Another example here is of Carl von Linné, or as you probably know him, Carolus Linnaeus. I guess, are you aware of this? He was the greatest biologist and biologic classicist of the 1700s. He introduced a system of classifying living organisms with two Latin names. Like you all know that we as a species are known as Homo sapiens. This goes back to Linnaeus. He introduced that system. And so he wrote also, I saw the infinite, all-knowing and omnipotent God. I followed his footprints over the fields of nature, and saw everywhere in eternal wisdom and power and inscrutable perfection. Even as late as 1857, Louis Agassiz, who was one of the most prominent natural scientists in the 1800s, he was a professor at Harvard University, he stated, the living world shows also premeditation, wisdom, greatness, prescience, omniscience, providence. Natural history must, in good time, become the analysis of the thoughts of the creator of the universe as manifested in the animal and vegetable kingdoms as well as in the inorganic world. So this is in 1857 one of the greatest scientists of his time states that science, here he writes natural history, which more or less is the same word which later was substituted by biology. By natural history means biology. And so he states that biology should ultimately be an analysis of the thoughts of the creator of the universe. So again, that seems pretty far out to the way we think in the contemporary world, but that again, that was mainstream thought in 1857. Of course, this changed radically just 2 years later when Darwin published his On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, where he proposed a mechanism that seemingly could explain the total complexity of life in a so-called natural way with purely physical process, chemical processes, chance, and nothing else. Darwin's book became an overnight bestseller, and from his time on, it became very quickly the norm that you could not really be accepted as a serious scientist without being a natural evolutionist. Darwin, it was one of the most drastic changes in the mindset within science that has ever happened. So, and yeah, here's some examples from the Origin of Species. Darwin actually tried to argue. He writes here, I would view all beings not as special creations, but as lineal descendants of some few beings. This special creation refers to the idea that each species is created separately and not evolved from each other. So Darwin, he argues against that, and he claims that the evidence supports the idea that all species descend from a common ancestor. This is lineal descendants of human beings. This is his way of expressing descendant from a common ancestor. Here another quote from, this is from a later book where he explains this idea of the origin of species. So he writes here, in brackets, in the origin of species, I had two express purposes in mind. First, to show that species had not been separately created, and second, that natural selection had been the most important cause of change. So he's arguing two things. He's arguing against special creation or separate creation. That's one thing. And then he argues for natural selection. His term natural selection actually covers more than just strict selection. By natural selection, he actually refers to purely natural processes, because, and I'll get to that a little in a few minutes, because selection is not a creative process as such. You need new varieties created in the first place before the selection can act. Darwin referred by natural selection, Darwin has both in mind. So Darwin is a naturalist. We could also use the word materialist, which means that he thinks that there is nothing but matter ultimately. Or naturalist refers to this idea, or the philosophy that nature, and here we mean physical nature, is self-sufficient. It can explain itself. You don't need anything outside the physical to explain all features within the physical. That's the idea of naturalism. And so, because some, and that became also an idea in the time after Darwin, many tried to save the place for religion or God by proposing that yes, evolution definitely took place, and that was God's way of creating all life forms. And well, that's possible. I mean, that's definitely we can say that's a hypothesis. And if God exists, why not? He could do it if he wanted to. However, this is not Darwin. Darwin is a naturalist and materialist. It's important to have that in mind. So, again, this quote here from Dr. Ayala: Darwin's great accomplishment was to show that the complex order and function of living creatures can be explained as a result of a natural process without having to refer to a creator or some other external factor. Now, if you actually take a closer look at this statement, there's something that's not quite right about it. And that's where it's, wait a minute. You missed out something. What's wrong with this is that he misses or glances over that Darwin's original theory was actually rejected within a matter of a decade or two after he published The Origin of Species. And all evolutionists today are not Darwinists, but they're neo-Darwinists. Neo-Darwinism is a later theory, later development. But in the strict sense of the term, Darwin's theory, the mechanism posed in The Origin of Species, was disproven. So, to claim that Darwin shows that the complex order can be explained by a natural process is actually not correct. Darwin didn't really show it. He has, invoked the time of naturalism, but scientifically speaking, no, he didn't show as such that the complex order can be explained by a purely natural process. It's interesting to have a look at where Darwin was wrong. It's not a criticism of the person, the man Darwin as such, because of course, everyone has their rights. The scientist has a right to propose a theory and to have it tested. Nothing wrong with that. But it's interesting still to have a look at where he was wrong, because even today there are many, even professional biologists, who are not really clear on that actually these are mistaken and long ago disproven ideas. So Darwin's first mistake was to assume that species are endlessly mutable, and through breeding, races or sorts may become new species. Here Darwin, he writes, nevertheless, according to my view, varieties are species in the process of formation, or are, as I have And Darwin, he especially referred to man's artificial breeding on animals. Darwin was actually a very expert animal breeder himself. He could create all kinds of varieties of pigeons by breeding. And he assumed or proposed that since we can affect enormous changes within the species, through breeding over relatively few generations, then nature must be able to produce much greater changes over thousands and even millions of years. And it's a fact. Breeding can affect massive changes. Take dogs. We have Great Danes, and we have tiny poodles and chihuahuas, and everything in between of all kinds of colors and forms and furs and smells of dogs. You name it. You can get such a variety. So it seems reasonable that if you keep on this process for a long enough time, we can end up with practically anything. Isn't it reasonable? Yeah. However, no matter how reasonable it is, all observation points to that there are actually limits for how much breeding can accomplish. Here's a quote from a famous plant breeder with the Burbanks, who wrote, "I know from experience that I can develop a plum half an inch long or 2.5 inches long with every possible length in between, but I'm willing to admit that it's hopeless to try to get a plum the size of a small pea or one as big as a grapefruit. I have roses that bloom pretty steadily for 6 months of the year, but I have none that will blossom 12, and I will not have. In short, there are limits to the development possible." And that's actually what is being observed through breeding. And even though Darwin thought it reasonable, he should in one sense have known better, because breeding is not a new science. Mankind has been breeding animals and plants for millennia. And breeders have also always known you can push the variety to a certain limit, but then they start dying off, or there is a limit. And also, all later research later on has actually shown that even as late as 2010 or 2012, Chicago University professor Lenski published the results from probably the most extensive breeding experiments ever undertaken, which was breeding on bacteria, where he and his colleagues have been breeding cultures of bacteria for 35 years, and by deliberate selection trying to create new species of bacteria. And the overall conclusion was, it's not possible. No, very few changes were affected by Lenski's experiments. So that was Darwin's first mistake. Secondly, Darwin mistakenly thought that acquired traits are inherited. And from all the species, showing what Darwin talks about, the great and inherited development of the others in cows and goats in countries where they are habitually milked, in comparison with the state of these organs in other countries, is another instance of the effect of use and changes in the organisms. Here's another quote from the facts alluded to in the first chapter. I think there can be little doubt that use in our domestic animals strengthens and enlarges certain parts, and disuse diminishes them, and that such modifications are inherited. These are wrong ideas. And this is actually, for those who are biologists, you are aware of Lamarck, the French Darwin's, who preceded Darwin by almost 100 years, who actually, because the idea of natural evolution was not, in that sense, completely new. There were others before Darwin who proposed other ideas of evolution. Lamarck was one of them. And he had the idea, the famous example of Lamarck is that how the giraffe got its long neck, where he assumed or proposed that the deer species at one point, some individuals start stretching their leg to eat what no others could eat. As a result, got a longer neck, and got cats with longer necks who had an advantage and stretched their legs even longer, and this way gradually got giraffes. And many are not aware, Darwin many places denounces Lamarck, but in this case he's actually Lamarckian himself. Darwin is more or less a Lamarckian in this case. His idea is that changes affected to the organism are passed on to the next generation. If I go to do exercise, bodybuilding, develop strong muscles, then I get children that have bigger muscles. If I go to I'm from a North European country where we happen to see the sun 2 hours a year or something like that. So that's why we're so pale. So if I move to another country like South Africa, which has a lot of sunshine, and I get beautiful, brown or black tan, like many of you have, then I could get children with darker skin. So Darwin is a little, excuse that because the laws of inheritance were not known at his time. Actually, they were discovered at the same time by Greta Mendel, but his research didn't become public until a couple of decades later. So the laws of inheritance were not really known at the time of Darwin. However, what Darwin assumed about inheritance in this turned out to be completely wrong. Inherited traits are not, acquired traits are not inherited. And this is an important part of his theory, because as I said, natural selection as such is not the prime mechanism. It needs new variety for selection to work on before there can be any kind of evolution. Where does this new variety come from? Darwin proposed from acquired traits being inherited. That was his mechanism of new variety arising. So, just to recap, Darwin's idea was that species are endlessly mutable. External influences and use of organs create new genetic material. Acquired traits are inherited. Darwin's theory was rejected around 1875 by research by Francis Galton and others. And those who believe in Darwin, in fact, don't believe in Darwin. Just for information. You probably believe in a form of neo-Darwinism, which is the idea that genetic mutations create new genes, which ultimately make you rise to new species in otherwise stable species. Here the crucial word is mutations. Many think this is Darwin, but Darwin doesn't know. The word mutation does not exist at Darwin's time. It's later. It was discovered after or with Mendel that genetic material is stable. Inheritance involves stable genetic factors being passed on from generation, being combined, of course, in innumerable ways, but nevertheless constant factors being passed on from generation to generation to generation. Then, after that, it was discovered, yes, it's all very constant, very stable, but sometimes there is a change. Sometimes there's a freak, and they were called freaks of nature to begin with. Later on, they were called mutations. When the structure of DNA was discovered and so on from 1950s and onwards, it was discovered that mutations are copying errors on the DNA when the DNA is copied during cell division, and that's what mutations are. So, of course, then the next question is neo-Darwinism a sufficient explanation for the complexity found in living organisms? That's there are reasons to think it is not. and it's a long discussion. I'll try to give a couple of the reasons and arguments why that also might be a fallacious idea. I'm going to use malaria parasites, malaria parasites, because they're interesting to study if you don't have malaria. Here's a drawing of malaria parasites in different stages of development. And one interesting thing is that that's in humans. In some humans, it's found a particular peculiar mutation which causes a condition which is called sickle cell anemia. It's a disease of the blood. Anemia is a disease condition of the blood where blood cells, instead of being round or spherical, are sickle formed like a half moon. And it's caused by a particular mutation. A mutation that is actually harmful. Mainly it's harmful because 25% of those who have it die from the disease. However, it turns out those who have sickle cell anemia are immune to malaria. So, even though sickle cell anemia is a harmful mutation, but in areas that are affected by malaria, and maybe 40% of the people dying out from malaria, greater numbers of sickle cell anemia survive. So that's cited as an example of a fatal mutation. But it illustrates that actually the number of the known fatal mutations actually are quite few. It's not an issue if mutations happen or not, they do all the time. Most are actually neutral, have no effect on the body or organism, and many are harmful. You can even, if you go to medical libraries, there are books, there's shelves of books with all the diseases that mutation cause. Down syndrome is an example of a mutation disease. And the number of actually cited favorable mutations are surprisingly small. This is being given. There are bacteria can develop resistance to antibiotics. Certain fish can develop anti-freeze protein actually by some gradual mutational process. So there are examples, but they are surprisingly few. And there are good reasons to think that mutations don't have that creative capacity that New Darwin actually assumes. Here is a map, world map, showing how malaria is spread, different strains of malaria, how it is spread in different parts of the world. And as we all know, it's basically a tropical disease. Now, we might ask, why is it tropical? And the reason is that it turns out that malaria parasites cannot survive when temperature drops below 16 degrees centigrade at any time of the day. They cannot propagate. So, and that's why it is a tropical disease. Now you might ask, that seems like a reason to ask, why haven't malaria parasites developed tolerance to lower temperatures through mutations, if mutations are such a great creative power or force as it is assumed? Because it would seem that they had plenty of opportunity to do so, because the number of malaria parasites existing or that have existed just over the last 10,000 years is staggering. Within the last 10,000 years, there have been more malaria parasites on Earth than there have been mammals for the last 100 million years. Just one person affected with malaria has billions of parasites in his body. So, if mutations were able to create new genetic variety to cause a rodent-like animal to develop or evolve into a great variety of mammals, including whales and elephants and lions and bats and us, for that, why can't the same mutations cause, or they're develop tolerance to a few degrees lower temperature. But it turns out that if the parasite should develop tolerance to lower temperatures, more mutations would have to happen simultaneously, and it's likely ever to happen anywhere practically in the universe, in spite of that's the staggering number of malaria parasites. So that also points to that perhaps mutations are not such a great source of new variety needed for evolution to actually take place. And I mean, there are many arguments and things like that, and many scientists today actually are becoming more and more skeptical of the idea of new Darwinism. Yes, you can go on the web. You can look up. There's a list where 800 plus natural scientists have signed a statement where that goes as: we are skeptical of claims for the ability of random mutation and natural selection to account for the complexity of life. Careful examination of the evidence for Darwinian theory should be encouraged. It's said around 800 natural scientists have signed this statement, and if you also would like to put your name on it, you have to minimum have a PhD in one of the natural hard sciences, physics, chemistry, biology, biochemistry, mathematics, and geology, and so on. The main reason why skepticism is spreading amongst certain scientists was also expressed by a conference that took place in 2008 in Vienna, in Austria, where the Konrad Lorenz Institute, one of the world's leading research institutes on evolutionary biology, invited to a conference called Toward an Extended Evolutionary Synthesis. They invited 16 of the world's leading theoretical biologists, and they explained themselves in the invitation as such. Not only we have witnessed the molecular revolution from the discovery of the structure of DNA to the genomic era, we are also grappling with increasing feeling that we just don't have the theoretical and analytical tools necessary to make sense of the bewildering diversity and complexity of living organisms. Or, I just pull out this sentence from that: we just don't have the theoretical tools necessary to make sense of the complexity of living organisms. And even the word theoretical tools could be substituted by theory. We don't have a theory that can make sense of the complexity of living organisms. Compare that with a statement we have from Franciscus Ayala that said Darwin came with a theory that would explain the complexity of living organisms. That's actually what they, from the Knowledge Institute, organized stated in the invitation. We don't have a theory that can explain the complexity of living organisms. Of course, it's really the biochemical, I might say, revolution over the past decades, or actually the past 50 years, that has caused that, where we have uncovered an astounding complexity on the molecular level, in particular within our cells. I have here a short film clip, which goes into a little about what is in the cell and how a cell works, and then there's animation showing some of the processes going on within the cell. See here.
Starting with a single cell. But what is a cell? That's a good question. Yeah. Darwin wrote The Origin of Species in 1859, published in 1859. He had an idea of the cell as being quite simple, correct? Yeah, everybody did. Yeah, okay. If he thought of the cell as being a bureau, what is the cell now in terms of its complexity by comparison? A galaxy. If Darwin thought a cell was, say, a mud hut, what do we now know that a cell is?
More complicated than a Saturn V.
So what is in the cell?
A have the famous DNA double helix. You can see the two helical strands that are intertwined and wound around each other on the outside of the molecule. This is the material that stores all of our genetic information. In higher life forms, this would be the equivalent of something like a gigabyte of information stored in the molecules that form the individual chromosome, all packed within the nucleus, which is a tiny fraction of the entire cell size. So what does DNA do? Well, the information in DNA ends up providing the information for sequencing amino acids to make proteins. We have information in a one-dimensional form that provides the information for a three-dimensional form.
I'm finally just beginning to grasp the complexity of the cell. Are there systems within the cell that go well beyond their regular function? Something of cellular technology that drives activation, replication, quality data? What if these new mechanisms have massive design implications? Well, I say, so be it.
But anyway, that gives a little idea why the organizers come as Lawrence wrote. We don't have the theoretical tools necessary to make sense of the complexity of living organisms, because what has been uncovered inside our cell and cell structures is actually nothing simple, but it's the most complex ever discovered anywhere in the universe, practically. Cells have turned out to be actually what looks like some science fiction nanotechnology with all kinds of amazing, even like nano robots. You might even notice, I haven't noticed just in one of the last images, there was a kind of a creature on two legs walking down a line. Actually, there are machines that walk on legs, two legs inside our cells, on lines carrying other molecules from one end to the other. Amazing. And maybe the most amazing thing is that actually the technology inside the cell is, you might say, it's digital technology, like computer technology. The genetic information found on the DNA is a form of information as much as in a computer. It's only more advanced. In other words, it's information, it's text, it's software, it's symbols, it's codes, and nothing physical. There's nothing about the chemical properties of DNA that specifies the message found on DNA. It's too, just as there's nothing about the hardware of the computer that specifies the software. Precisely the same. And where does this information come from? As we stand now, there is zero theory that explains the origin of this information. And for all we know, we can get into that, is just one quote from another, Jeffrey Baylor, another prominent scientist in the field of origin of life, who stated explicitly that, but it is just as today, 60 years later. He stated, today, as we leave the 20th century, we still face the problem that we had when we entered the 20th century. How did life originate on Earth? So, shortly put, as we stand today, basically there is no theory of evolution. Scientifically speaking, we have no theory, no clear theoretical model that can explain the complexity that we find in living organisms. Many believe in evolution, and that's fine, but it's basically a belief. There's not really any testable scientific theory that can support it as of now. Which is why today, as scientists who are, as this is Richard Thomson here, it's actually back from 1976, an American mathematician who stated, we'd like to argue that the chance of molecular forces theory won't explain things like this, but to say that there is intelligent design would be a sensible explanation. And this is my last slide in this introductory presentation. My question is here, we can take different leads. How I'm doing time-wise?